Hotline Miami was developed by Dennaton Games and released on Windows in 2012, and then for everything else in the years that followed. Hotline Miami 2, Wrong Number, was released in 2015. The original Hotline Miami is one of a handful of games I believe to be perfect. I was 14 when I first played it, and it blew my mind the way I imagine Doom did for a lot of kids. At the time, I probably wouldn't have known how to describe the feeling I got playing it. But now I would say that Hotline Miami is a game about sublime violence. The sequel came out a year after I played the first game, and I found it disappointing at the time. There were flashes of it that I really enjoyed, but it felt like the focus on explicit storytelling and the lengthy, wide-open levels were a step back. One of the reasons I returned to the series was to see if I'd been right about Wrong Number. The answer is going to take a little while to get to, because before talking about Wrong Number, we have to completely dissect the first game. Hotline Miami's first impression is great. The title screen tells us everything we need to know. The psychedelic music, palm trees, and swaying neon text gives us a first glance at Hotline Miami's overwhelming, masterfully executed aesthetic. Start Game pulses invitingly, and the Russian title is a foreshadowing story hint. It's not a complicated piece of graphic design, but Hotline Miami sets a tone within its first moments, and it maintains that tone for the rest of the game. Because the design of its interface meshes so well with the gameplay, playing the game always feels like a whole and distinct experience. The world doesn't necessarily feel real the way Rain Worlds does, but the design of these little UI elements seemingly seamlessly ties the game together, even if each level is clearly delineated. This attention to detail didn't come out of nowhere. Half of Dennaton, Jonathan Soderstrom, aka Cactus Squid, has made a ton of games. I played all the ones that I could get running, and they've changed the way that I think about Hotline Miami. Hotline Miami and almost all of Soderstrom's other games are made in Game Maker, so they probably share some common DNA. More than that though, Hotline Miami feels like a link in the chain of Cactus Squid games. The design is a bare-bones shoot-'em-up, where the player controls two characters at once. You shoot squares when they turn white. It's difficult to control, and I slipped between competence and total cognitive overload in the short time I spent with it. For a few moments, the game really clicked with me, and my control over it felt kind of miraculous. It's one of the most memorable Cactus Squid games, and it's satisfying when you get it, but I imagine most people will get bored of its single screen before ever mastering the controls. Despite the simplistic graphics, the visual design lays the entire machinery of the game out for you. Enemy pathing and spawn rate, your position, shots taken, shots hit, and elapsed time are all shown on screen. Even with the obvious limitations that the design has, it's clear that care was put into its aesthetic, and it has great music. This attention to detail is present in all of Cactus Squid's games. Seizure Dome is a top-down shooter that pits you against endless waves of bikinied women, babies, and other strange flesh creatures. It feels like a proto-Hotline Miami. Of course it has a similar control scheme, but there's also loud music, intrusive psychedelic screen effects, and a focus on high scores. All of Cactus Squid's games have at least one of these elements in them, and most also require precise digital inputs for movement, give you one life, and have very fast restarts. Finally, I have to talk about Gamma 4, an awesome and painfully short game where you control 4 dots that collect other, bigger dots, and avoid red lasers and bullets. The visuals are wonderful, and they make an otherwise interesting little puzzle game into a much more memorable experience. Beyond the visuals, I think Gamma 4 is difficult the same way Hotline Miami is difficult. You start a level with some idea of what the threats will be, but those threats evolve and become more chaotic as you start probing them. Both games restart you instantly, and after a few deaths you start to develop a strategy. In Gamma 4 you can't stop moving, so you have to plan in advance of each fire rope, times door, or cannon. In Hotline Miami you need to move fast enough to keep a combo going, but slow enough to not get overwhelmed by enemies. The tactics emerge in your path through the level and the weapons you pick up along the way. Both games have these tactical and reactive elements. You have to deal with immediate threats, but you plan your route in advance. In the tutorial, we play as a guy the developers call the Pig Butcher. The tutorial introduces us to a side of Miami that's different from the one the title screen promises. We're in a dimly lit alley where the Pig Butcher brutalizes unarmed mobsters. I won't say much about it yet, but keep the juxtaposition between the bright colors of the title screen and the dark ultra-violence of the tutorial in mind. After a story sequence, we're in the protagonist Jacket's apartment, and the game begins in earnest with a message left on his answering machine. There are tons of little details about Jacket's character in his apartment, and it changes in between each level. The amount of attention paid to establishing an atmosphere, even before the first level, is impressive. We can already see that Hotline Miami isn't just some game mechanical experiment or toy. The first few levels are a good on-ramp, but Hotline Miami hits its stride in level 3, Decadence. The level opens with a punchy, distorted bass line as we fade in on Jacket standing outside a lavish apartment. We cut a mobster's throat and his blood sprays the foyer, plus 600 points rises from his body, like a day-glow ghost. The pulsing backdrop celebrates each kill and our entire world sways nauseously back and forth. The pace is breakneck, and we paint the carpet with 2 more mobsters. Gore is depicted unflinchingly. Brains splatter the floor and corpses crawl around. By the end, everything is stained with blood. It's cathartic and utterly satisfying. The points, combos, and music drive us onward. Upstairs, there are more people to kill, so we kill them. Expensive rugs, pool tables, and the heads of endangered animals spectate the violence. And then it's over. After the last enemy is killed, the music abruptly shuts off, and you're forced to look at the results of your work soberly. This turn, from feverish violent fun to quiet reflection, forces you to consider why you've done these things. The introspection isn't necessarily deep, but the game makes it unavoidable every time. Decadence offers us these perfect controls and its tight, tense level design. It gives us this sinister change in mood and the sublime violence that precedes it. And then Hotline Miami does the same thing 16 more times. Jacket controls with the machine-like precision of a spaceship in a shoot-'em-up. When you lock into Hotline Miami, you really appreciate this. It's only possible to react as quickly as your character can move, and the difference between life and death is usually a few frames. Any amount of sluggishness in Jacket's movement would make the game feel tedious and probably unfair. The responsiveness lets you keep up with the fast but predictable enemy AI, and it also makes you responsible for each death. The game has 3 enemy types: and when they aren't attacking you, they either stand still or patrol the room. Mobsters are the most common enemies by far, and they generally die in one shot. These big guys aren't affected by melee attacks, and shooting them starts a bleed-out timer on them. Decadence teaches you this by making the first encounter with one into a boss fight. The bleed timer shortens depending on how many shots you've landed. Dogs fill out the roster. Their movements are quick and erratic, and your fists do nothing against them. They lose interest in you quickly, but this makes their patrol path in each level unpredictable. At first, every level is calm, and the mobsters move around it like clockwork. Nothing's really hidden from you, and you can even go around the outside of each level to plan an attack. Once you start shooting, things get messier. Enemies are sometimes alerted to you by noises or vision, and they'll either try to kill you or they'll lose interest and start patrolling new, random areas. Managing enemies requires some finesse. You can't cancel your attack animations, so you're committed to finishing each attack. Swinging a bat or firing a shotgun doesn't take long, but like Jacket, the mobsters are fast and precise. Ground kills take a lot longer, and you're committed to those as well. I'll take you through Chapter 10, Hot and Heavy, to demonstrate some of the tactics and moment-to-moment decisions that I make while I'm playing. I immediately ground kill this guy, take his knife, and try to throw it at the guard at the top left. I miss, but manage to kill both anyway. Knives are very fast, so I pick one up and kill these two guys who saw me earlier. I pick up a shotgun and miss twice. Fearing that I won't have time to kill the two guys following me, I throw the shotgun and knock both of them out. The mask I picked gives me extra ammo, so I decide to blind fire a bit, then make my way down this hallway. I grab this guy's attention with gunshots, take his weapon, and kill these two static guards. Guns are pretty versatile, so I always try to take one with me through a screen transition. The opening of this area is cramped, but instead of waiting, I try to take everybody I can out with an assault rifle. I manage to kill most of my immediate threats and knock one guy down. In this room, I make the mistake of pulling too many enemies at once. In the upper room, I kill 3 mobsters and get the attention of a few others. Then I quickly move into the lower right. Now people are pursuing from 2 different directions, and I hesitate and get myself killed. To avoid getting overwhelmed, I stick with a knife this time. I blind fire down this hallway to take care of anyone left down there, and I end up pulling this guy. Now I know that the only people left are in this sauna room on the right, so I can use guns without attracting any extra attention. Again, I pick up a gun and take it with me. This room is uniquely large and open, so taking the middle path will almost definitely get me killed. At first I try to do a loud entrance by firing the shotgun and attracting attention. Enemies don't have friendly fire, so they can easily block each other, which makes situations like this difficult to handle. I tried the same thing a bunch more times. It seems possible to beat the room this way, but I couldn't make it work. After a while, I start trying different routes, going top and bottom and firing the shotgun in different places. I finally hit on a strategy that seems to work. Going up top reduces the line of sight for the mobsters, and the places where I fire only pull a few melee guys. You can see I'm giving the dogs a pretty wide berth. They can often come out of nowhere. I shoot everyone I can see, and then, knowing that there are a bunch of windows, I blind fire the double barrel and pick up a few more kills that way. I don't want to take any chances at this point, so I kill this guy very carefully. This room teaches me a couple of things immediately. Firing a gun will attract a lot of attention, and because of this it's possible to rack up a giant combo. I'm just trying to finish the level, so I go for a quieter approach here. On my second run, I noticed that this mobster and dog can be hit at the same time, which is convenient. Another hint that you should be stealthy is the presence of the thug. They can block a lot of bullets, which gives the mobsters behind them time to shoot you. I'll want to deal with him one-on-one if I can. This is a really tight screen. You can see just how many people come running every time I shoot. This screen shows the interplay between reaction and strategy that Hotline Miami requires. The AI is predictable, but you can't tell exactly how an enemy is going to move or if they'll hear you. The exact gun or melee weapon held by each enemy is also randomized every time you load a level. There are subtle differences between each weapon, so every run keeps you on your toes. There's always an element of reaction to the combat, but on a larger scale each level presents itself as a puzzle. With each death, I'm probing the game to see what exactly I can get away with, and then I slowly build up a strategy. First, I discover throwing my weapon at this guy in the hall, then killing the mobster and dog. Next, I figure out that I can safely kill the mobsters in this room on the right, then I see I can dash across the hallway. Once I'm in there, I have a choke point so I can safely start firing a gun. Now I've covered most of the map and the rest just falls into place. This simple loop of dying and getting just a little bit further is the core of Hotline Miami. Its greatest moments are those in which it feels absolutely impossible, because the game itself is the slow, repetitive development of a perfect run. The repetition quickly desensitizes us to the gore, and the gameplay becomes a process of stripping out everything that doesn't work, and refining everything that does. Hotline Miami is the video game equivalent of which elevates dirt into a work of art.
Hikaru Dordango is Japanese for shiny dumpling, I think is the exact translation. Once I read about it, I had to do it myself. I was out doing it the next day. It took me 30 tries, maybe even a little bit more. I was very persistent at it and kept at it solid for probably a month. I'm continuously interested in different things. I always want to experiment with different soils, and there's always the chance I'll get better at it, something I can improve on. It's very relaxing that way, and it's so easy to get sucked into a flow state.
This is what I mean by sublime violence. With that said, the game still has a scoring system, so some
泥団子
are clearly better than others. You're scored on 6 different criteria. Killings represent the point numbers you see when you kill someone. The exact value depends on what weapon you used and whether or not it was a ground kill. Boldness is about being loud. The game uses the boldness score to incentivize fast and dangerous play. Slamming doors, picking up weapons, or killing people while exposed to enemies gives you boldness points. Combos are self-explanatory. A higher combo is always better. The time bonus starts at 9,000 and slowly ticks down to 0, so you're supposed to play fast. The flexibility score is raised by using unique weapons. The mobility score is based on how far you moved in each level. The game also shows a list of actions performed, which recount how many times you were exposed and how big your combos were and other things like that. These affect the score categories and are used to assign you a playstyle for the level, which is just a fun bonus. Getting a high score in each level unlocks a new mask, and your overall score goes toward weapon unlocks. It's unfortunate that Hotline Miami has no way to rate your tactical ability, but the ranking system does push players toward perfect, dynamic, moment-to-moment execution and huge combos. The strategic side of things is like an information gathering stage that builds up to a perfect run. The challenges of Hotline Miami often seem insurmountable. In this level, Deadline, every move feels like a new ambush. There are 5 enemies around every corner, and if your aim, timing, and movement are off, you don't stand a chance. But of course, by restarting over and over, you eventually build up an elegant route that climaxes in a perfect run. While we're here, I have to say that this boss fight sucks. Enemies spawn from this truck, but they often shoot you before you can even see them. And if you manage to kill a mobster, a thug will spawn on top of you and will just whack you instantly. And the whole time, there's a guy tossing Molotov cocktails to keep you moving. Getting through it feels like pure luck. As I've said already, Hotline Miami has a very focused and deliberate aesthetic. It provides a texture and context for the violence by mirroring the frantic movement and pace of the game. The sudden stops create a kind of tension between the player's celebration of violence and its actual consequences. However, I think there's more to it than just a contrast of bright colors and loud music with actual gruesome deaths.
So today's hangover is sponsored by the Embassy and Devolver Digital. And a bunch of fucked up indie developers, so thank you.
According to a talk that the 2 members of Denaton gave at Fantastic Arcade, the framing of Hotline Miami, its plot, its themes, and its aesthetic were inspired by a couple of movies.
The first one was Drive. We watched it like a couple of weeks before we started working on the game, and it's a really great movie. And one of the good things about it is that the plot is actually not that interesting or good, but it's so stylish that you don't mind that the plot doesn't really do anything special. But there's like a decisive moment where the movie could go one way or another. The movie goes one way, and I guess our game like is what would have happened maybe if it had gone the other way. So this is pretty much the basic setup for each level in the game. You're just standing outside with the mask on, and there's all these people inside that you're gonna kill. And they're all assholes.
Drive, especially its soundtrack, popularized the musical and visual aesthetic called synthwave, a retro-futurist revision of the 1980s. It takes a lot of inspiration from Blade Runner, and if you image search synthwave, you'll see a million variations of this image. It also sometimes bears the name Outrun, taken directly from the Sega arcade game. While synthwave is gritty at times, its vision of the world is largely utopian. It's happy to bathe in its own aesthetic, and is mainly about turning 80s nostalgia into a world of its own. Violence is often depicted so stylishly that it becomes unreal. This is unsurprising, since synthwave is explicitly based on stylized movies. As a result, though, any edge present in synthwave art feels manufactured. It's either a Disney ride or an ironic joke. I came up with two archetypal examples of this while I was working on the video. I'm not saying these are pure synthwave art, but they have synthwave elements in them, and they get the point across pretty well. Ready Player One, the 2018 movie, is a full-on CGI blockbuster where the characters can imagine themselves as protagonists in synthwave art. It doesn't adopt this aesthetic fully, but the plot is driven by 80s and 90s pop culture worship.
Yeah, I see it. That's Kaneda's bike from Akira. 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 That's Kaneda's bike from Akira.
And it takes place in a world literally constructed from nostalgia. The movie depicts a sort of immaculate consumption, where the characters can become one with the objects of their memories. They merge themselves with a classic movie at one point, and many of them represent themselves with video game or film characters.
Come play with us.
Oh, girls, y'all know how to get out of here?
No, 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 no! No, 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 no!
Synthwave entertains this desire pretty openly. It wants Blade Runner to be real.
They're a benefit, it's not my problem. Not my problem.
On the ironic end of the scale, Kung Fury is a 2015 short film that tries to be a cheesy 80s action movie.
Right here.
And that's really as deep as we need to go. I'm not trying to say that synthwave is universally cheesy. There's tons of great synthwave art out there, Hotline Miami's soundtrack being a prime example. But I think those two extreme examples make it clear that there's more to Hotline Miami than just synthwave. It isn't ironically distanced from its subject matter, and the violence that it depicts certainly isn't pushed under the rug. There are a stunning number of unique kill animations, and they prominently feature blood, vomit, urine, and brain matter.
And also, I watched this documentary called Cocaine Cowboys, and the game was also named after Cocaine Cowboys for a while. So yeah, this film sort of makes sense of all the entering houses with full of people that has machine guns and weapons.
The Latin American influence has given Miami a unique flavor.
In the 70s, when I first came down here, everybody was smuggling pot in. The Colombians realized they had a gold mine here. Everybody that before was doing these pot things was now into doing cocaine.
The Colombians threw a number at us, $3,000 a kilo. In their first trip, we got paid $1.2 million.
Popularity, it began to shoot up. I had never seen so much cocaine in my entire life. I had lawyers, I had doctors.
Somebody that could afford what it cost.
Cocaine deaths in Dade County have now jumped to about 2 a week.
Shotguns, Uzi, handguns.
It was the beginning of a war.
Isela Blanco was the godmother of the cocaine trade. One mean lady. She likes us to cut people up in little pieces, put them in a small box with a little bow on top. She said, that's the way I do my things.
You have 5 people killed here, 3 people killed here. Mass murder.
Miami was the most dangerous place on earth.
They called them the Cocaine Cowboys.
They called them the Cocaine Cowboys.
Cocaine Cowboys.
This is why Miami is for you.
So I think around this time we decided to do the game in Miami.
Yeah.
You know why?
Cocaine Cowboys is a documentary about the cocaine trade in Miami. It depicts real historical violence. Almost all of America's weed and cocaine flowed through Miami in the 80s, and, predictably, hundreds of people were killed in turf wars. Obviously, the movie provides a setting, but I think putting the events of the game into this more realistic context is a big part of why it works so well. Again, we return to this contrast. Hotline Miami's story is ambiguous and psychedelic, but the violence is clear and real. While Hotline Miami conforms superficially to a synthwave style, it can't just be lumped in with the thousands of neon sunset wallpapers online. There's a real substance to the game's style. Dennaton knew what they were doing, and the game's aesthetic can easily be read as a critique of synthwave. Hotline Miami exposes how grotesque synthwave's vision of the world really is. The neon and excess and decadence that synthwave celebrates can't exist without the cruelty and violence that Hotline Miami makes explicit. The game sees us literally bathing status symbols in blood. More important than that is the tension the game sets up between the presentation of events and what you're actually doing. The game glorifies violence, but it's also able to make you face up to that violence. Jacket is asked if he enjoys hurting people, and while that's a rhetorical question, it does force the player to at least consider it. The turn in the music at the end of a level is an obvious example, but this tension is set up even before the first level. There's something very strange about receiving a phone call from Tim at the bakery, and then showing up and killing everyone at the address. It's just a code, of course, but the contrast between presentation and reality continues to come up as a theme. There's a latent reality in the game that only shows up at certain times. In the main action of a level, it disappears in the frantic pace and style, but directly afterwards, reality and responsibility confront us. The interlude between levels also contains this tension. Jacket is doing mundane, normal things, but the cashier is always the same guy, gives him stuff for free, and seems to know things about him. The developers describe the song that plays during these sequences as Lynchian, and it takes on a sinister edge once corpses start appearing everywhere. The game becomes uncomfortably surreal. At the end of Decadence, Jacket rescues a woman who eventually becomes his girlfriend. She moves in with him, and his apartment changes subtly over the course of the game. It indicates the growth of their relationship, and gives us a sense that time is passing. You might not even notice these little changes on your first playthrough. Much like the slow evolution of Jacket's apartment, a lot of Hotline Miami's story happens in the background. When the plot does take center stage, it's pretty cryptic. For the most part, you just get a phone call, go to the address, and kill everybody. At the beginning of the first 3 parts of the game, Jacket speaks to these masked figures who clearly exist in his imagination, and they give him hints about the events of the game. Beyond that, there are these weird symbols painted everywhere, and we find a few guys who failed their missions. Although the masked figures indicate that Jacket is conflicted about killing, since they chastise him about the awful things he's been doing, he doesn't really seem curious about who he's working for, and his struggle is largely an internal one. Part 4 opens with Jacket's girlfriend being murdered by a guy named Richter. He then wakes up in a hospital. The previous levels have all been him recollecting the past few months in a coma. It's kind of a lukewarm reveal that doesn't add anything to the game, but doesn't really take anything away either. Mechanically, Jacket's coma dreams and the actual levels that follow are identical. It explains away the fuzzy line between ideality and reality as just a dream, which I find kind of disappointing, but the themes are still there. One aspect I do find interesting is that Jacket remembers the killing he's done as the frantic, euphoric rampage that I described earlier. His inner conflict about what he's doing is given form in the corpses and death that begin to intrude into his everyday life. Jacket is an empty character, but the player identifies with him because their experience of Hotline Miami's gameplay and style mirrors the way that Jacket feels when he's killing people. Jacket's inner conflict is hinted at in the mask system as well. Thematically, they represent a division between the Jacket who is killing mobsters and what Jacket sees as his real self, represented by his relationship with his girlfriend. He can't really face up to the truth of his situation. Not only is he murdering people, but he likes doing it too. He only gains a character motivation when the violence bleeds into his normal life, with the murder of his girlfriend. Even when his identity is known by the police, Jacket keeps wearing a mask, further solidifying the line between himself as murderer and himself as human being. Obviously, Jacket representing himself as an animal shows a kind of surrender to basic violent instincts as well. Mechanically, the different masks give special abilities. They're awarded at the end of each level if you get a high score, and some levels have additional masks that you can pick up. They sometimes twist the game's formula in interesting ways, and they provide an incentive to get high scores, but it feels as though there were more mask slots than there were mask ideas. Some are just flat upgrades of others, and some just aren't that useful. There's no incentive to choose the mediocre masks over really great ones like Tony, who grants killing fists and an instant ground kill, Jake, who makes thrown objects lethal, or Don Juan, who makes doors lethal. There are also a few fun gimmick masks unlocked near the end of the game. Oscar bathes the level in darkness, Phil badly translates the game into French, and Nigel reverses the controls. Even with the bad ones, I think the masks are a worthwhile addition. You can build a distinct playstyle around many of them. Tony is so infamously overpowered that he's come to represent the game even more than Richard, one of the official mascots. We escape the hospital in the game's most unique level, which flips the formula on its head by making Jacket defenseless and difficult to control. Memorization is still important here, but the reaction element isn't really present. Jacket moves so erratically that it would be almost impossible to actually fight anybody. While Trauma isn't really a fun level, it's a short one that you only have to play once, and it marks an important point in the game's plot. Representing physical weakness through gameplay is difficult, but it was done well here with just a small tweak to the movement. Once he escapes, Jacket pursues revenge for the death of his girlfriend. Since the game has a concrete goal now, the rest of the levels have a bit of context. The last few chapters represent the height of Hotline Miami's difficulty, which is dictated mainly by level design. Rooms are large and open, with many lines of sight, and enemy density is higher than ever. The scales never quite tip to unfair, and the game manages to put the pressure on you without making every enemy in every level just chase you around. I also like this set piece in the police station. We have to dash between enemy-filled rooms, because standing in the open will get us killed immediately. There are a ton of these small change-ups in the game. They add another layer of challenge on the first playthrough, and on subsequent ones they just give you a bunch of fun variety throughout the game. It feels like there's a lot of stuff in Hotline Miami, even though it's only around 4 hours long. In Crackdown, the police show up before you beat the level. In Clean Hit, you're supposed to sneak around outside. And a few levels end with boss fights. However, these more difficult levels do shine a spotlight on the game's flaws. None of them are game-breaking, and an experienced player can usually work around them, but they're flaws nonetheless. Sometimes Jacket will refuse to enter an execution, even when his position seems to be correct. The same thing happens with picking up weapons. Door physics are kind of broken, and occasionally doors eat bullets. If you overlap an enemy, they often can't kill you. At best, these glitches break the flow of gameplay, and at worst, they result in a death. Fortunately, the majority of the game's screens take a minute at most to get through, so they don't ruin the game by any means. Since the attention to detail is so great in Hotline Miami, I have to imagine that these are some insurmountable issue with GameMaker 7, the game's engine. Whether that's the case or not is no excuse. The game has another bit of randomness that I neglected to mention earlier. Sometimes you or an enemy will survive a bullet. Like the randomized weapons, this creates even more possible variations on each level, and it forces you to react to threats rather than just relying on muscle memory. At the same time, you can't rely on surviving a bullet, because it's rare enough to feel almost serendipitous. Since I'm on a roll with these obscure mechanics, I'll also say that there's an opaque and seemingly useless hostage mechanic in the game as well. The final boss fight is intentionally over the top and kind of unsatisfying. On the scale of a whole level, the game's repetitive nature isn't frustrating, but when you're fighting 4 enemies in a small room with a short cutscene beforehand, it gets tedious pretty quickly. It is another interesting change-up, and I like that Jacket is killing a symbol of his own decadent and violent nature, but mechanically it's unclear when the Panthers are able to kill you, or when you're able to kill them. The last phase of the fight sees you hurling knives at the father to make him drop his guns, which I think is a clever use of the game's mechanics. And the suicide is a perfect end for a vindictive mob boss. it's not actually over yet. Just like Richard said, Jacket never actually gets answers. He suspects the Russian mafia, but never finds out who's actually pulling the strings. The Russian mafia is already on its way down, so there's also really no point to what Jacket's doing. After the main story ends, we switch to Biker's perspective. This character shows up in a boss fight earlier in the game, which ends with Jacket killing him with a golf club. Biker wants to know who is leaving the messages on his answering machine, and he ends up finding the actual perpetrators. Biker has 2 normal levels, a trivially easy boss fight, and a final level which is just dialogue. He's armed with a cleaver, which he can't drop, and 3 throwing knives. Since Biker can't pick up guns, his levels are much more compact than the previous ones, and they focus much more on execution than tactics. The enemy density is high, and accurate knife throwing is essential for getting high scores. There are mobsters with guns covering most corners, so you need to take positioning seriously as well. The level Fun and Games has a liberal amount of windows scattered around, which foreshadows Hotline Miami's sequel. The second floor in Fun and Games specifically feels like it has just one intended path. I'm sure every level has an intended route, but the designer's hand is especially transparent here, because deviating from it will get you killed immediately. Also, this bathroom has a massive window. Prank Call brings Biker to a telecommunications company called Phone Home. This puts Biker's story firmly in an alternate timeline. As Jacket, we kill Biker at the end of the 7th level, Neighbors. Finally, we enter Chapter 19, Resolution. I would wager that every first-time player gets the standard ending here. In earlier chapters, Jacket encounters these 2 menacing janitors that look like the game's developers. In Resolution, Biker finds out that they have been making the calls. Here's how that confrontation plays out. It's literally a fuck you to the player, which I think is an admirable choice. The janitors are pretty transparently just talking about developing Hotline Miami, instead of giving an explicit thesis statement or a story conclusion. This obscures the line between real and unreal even further, and it feels appropriate for such a surreal game to make you introspect about what it all meant, rather than just giving you an easy answer. And they're right, it was fun. But if you're very curious, there is an actual explanation. If you find 16 tiny puzzle pieces in Jacket's levels and arrange them into the phrase, "I was born in the USA," Biker can gain access to the computer in Chapter 19. I'll summarize the story for you. Hotline Miami takes place in an America where Russia took power, and the janitors are trying to dismantle the Russian mafia's presence in Miami, though they plan to upscale the operation. They, along with Jacket and Biker, are members of 50 Blessings, an American nationalist organization. Both Jacket and Biker have 50 Blessings pamphlets in their apartments, and the red logo, spray-painted in many areas, is some kind of 50 Blessings insignia. The janitors are leaving messages on members' phones and threatening violence if they don't comply. It's unclear if the janitors are revealing their true motivations, and Biker rightly points out that killing a bunch of mobsters won't really do anything. The true story is hinted at in those pamphlets I mentioned and in the title screen, where the Russian title is featured prominently. It's a matter of opinion whether you find this explanation satisfying or not, but I like that even the concrete answer Biker was searching for comes completely out of nowhere and doesn't really even explain why they're killing the mobsters. It's over the top the way the final boss is, but in my opinion it gives just enough context to enrich subsequent playthroughs. If the entire collection of Cactus Squid games had a theme, it would be reimagined shoot-'em-ups. Hotline Miami carries this theme on. Like a bullet hell shooter, winning requires extensive planning, map knowledge, and muscle memory. Victory is realized through perfect execution, and watching a great player reveals a kind of beautiful harmony in the bullets. Hotline Miami manages to make its style into an essential ingredient. The game would be worse if you changed its music or visuals. The story and themes are simplistic, as they often are in games, but they're delivered to us by way of the game's level design and action. While the gameplay and story are superficially cut up into segments, each blends with the other, and the game's style runs through the entire package. In my Amnesia Rebirth video, I mentioned the dissonance that often appears in that game. It felt like the plot and gameplay were constantly competing for attention, and this worked against the game's ultimate task of being scary. Combine that with the strange aesthetic choices, and you have a game that doesn't have much of an identity, or a lasting impact. Hotline Miami is the polar opposite. Everything in it contributes to its gameplay loop. All the context that surrounds the violence makes it, and the eventual turn in the music, even more impactful. It's as if every part of Hotline Miami revolves around this violence. Dennis Whedon, the other half of Denaton, focused and refined Soderstrom's creativity into a game that's not just an amazing top-down shooter, but also a coherent work of art. Themes appear from the simple action of exiting each building you enter, and the dread this creates builds as the fabric of reality collapses. The sublimely violent loop of the gameplay continues to be Hotline Miami's center of gravity, even as it tears its protagonist apart. Next time I'll discuss Hotline Miami's follow-up, Wrong Number, and we'll see what Denaton decided to keep, and what they decided to change. I'll be digging much deeper into the level design of each game to see how Dennaton's ideas and priorities changed in the sequel.